Hello, I'm Bob Scott. I hope you'll enjoy this video. Ever since I can remember, I've always liked to work with wood, mostly carpentry and building furniture. Then, in the early 70s, I discovered wildlife carving, primarily ducks and other birds. With that said, when we moved into our new home in Calvert County, Maryland in 1980, I had the builder put a cement pad alongside of the house as well as water and electric. When they completed the main house, I went to work constructing the shack. It finished out at 20 feet by 30 feet. I named it the Quack Shack because it was primarily used to create my waterfowl carvings. I wanted my carvings to be as realistic as possible. What better way would there be than to use live birds as models? So I built an aviary on one side of the shack and purchased a variety of wild ducks, pintails, mandarins, wood ducks, etc. I put a small pond in there for them. Next to the pond, I dug a 3-foot by 4-foot hole for an observation turret. That way, when I got into the turret, I was the same height as the birds, and they were not as skittish. This allowed me to get close-up shots for detailed reference. I also built a nesting box for the wood ducks. It had a side door for observation and cleanout. Over the years, I had several wood duck hatches. My wife, Estelle, liked to open the side door and check on the eggs and later the ducklings. One day, when she went out there, she opened the side panel. There, staring at her just inches away, was this huge black snake, all swollen up with duck eggs. Needless to say, that was the last time she ever looked into the nesting box. The good news was that whenever I had ducklings, and they matured, I'd release them into the community dock by the river. And then, believe it or not, a few of them would actually come back, landing outside the aviary, looking up their old friends. As I said, the primary reason for the aviary was to allow me to study the birds. And sometimes I'd capture one and use them as models by tethering them on the workbench in order to study the feather details up close as I carved. Over the years, I accumulated a lot of shop tools. A good many of them were standard woodworking tools you'd find in most workshops, such as saws, drills, routers, planes, etc. But the majority of my tools were dedicated to carving wildlife. The primary carving tool was the Fordham. The Fordham is a high-speed motor that has a long, flexible shaft. At the end of the shaft, you can attach various types of hand pieces. The hand pieces then accepts multiple chucks for grinding, sanding, and detailing wood. In reality, you can actually remove and shape wood as if it was clay. I thought when I built the shop, and then later added an additional room, it would be big enough. But as it turned out, as I accumulated more tools, space became limited. So I made some unique tool racks, one of which was the carousel, which allowed me to put several tools on it at the same time and then rotate them around as needed. The other was a flip stand. I attached a belt sander to one side and then was able to flip it over and use the wood planer. As I said, I accumulated many tools: a table saw and mounted a router on the end, a large throat band saw for shaping large wood cuts, and a host of other tools. In the back of the room was my supply storage and heating system and Nestle's bed. Nestle was a chocolate lab and the smartest and best dog I ever owned. When I take him for a walk, he would actually carry his own leash as if it was a stick and follow alongside me, never wandering off. Let me take a moment and tell you a short story about Nestle. I hope you'll appreciate it. One day, a feral cat started hanging around. I started feeding it and named it Shadow, and later put in a pet door into the shop for her. She quickly took a liking to Nestle, constantly following him around wherever he went outside, thus the name Shadow. She even would tag along when I took him for his walk. When Nestle was 13, he went blind. Now, I had trained Nestle never to do his business in the grass, to always go in the woods. Once he became blind, Shadow became his eyes. When I let him out, she would immediately come over to him, like she always did, only now she would hold up her tail, stand in front of him, and lead him into the woods. Unfortunately, she would never bring him back. I found that carving with hardwoods was rather difficult because it often splintered when I got into detailing feather quills and vanes. Some carvers use white pine, but I prefer tupelo, which is much more forgiving. Most tupelo gum trees grow in the southern swamps. The carving wood is located in the lower part of the tree, close to the water. Tupelo will not fuzz up when using high-speed burrs like other softwoods do. One drawback is, though, the usage block size. Whenever I made a large piece, say over 18 inches, I'd have to glue several pieces together. Over the years, I only sold a few carvings. I only sold a few because after I did the math, by taking the number of hours carving and divided it by the hundreds of dollars that I got, it turned out I was working for about 75 cents an hour. Let me show you a few of the other carvings that I did over the years. I did a lot of carving in the beginning, but was never satisfied until 1983 when I carved this canvasback miniature. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than most of them that I had done up to that point. Another of my early carvings were these miniature flying geese. I learned how to do these when I went to Jim Vesey's carving seminar back in the early 80s. I probably made more of these carvings than any other bird I've done over the years. That's because they were relatively simple and a lot of friends and relatives wanted copies. I even gave free training classes to friends and relatives. Here's one of the classes that I gave for my grandchildren, David, Sarah, and Ashley. And here's another class that I gave to my son, Ken, and my other granddaughter, Lisa. Last I heard, they still have them. I also went to Jim Sprankle's carving school on Kent Island, Maryland. Jim is a blue ribbon carver and author. He has won several world carving contests. One of the awards he won was for this pintail drake. When I found out that he was having a 5-day carving class for pintail drakes, I jumped at the chance. Going to that class gave me a quantum leap in my carving and painting. Incidentally, that's where I got the idea about putting up an aviary beside my shop. I carved several pintails over the years. This one I carved in 1981. One year I entered a pintail in the Ward Foundation show in Ocean City and was lucky enough to win a ribbon. Actually, the pintail is my favorite bird. I even made one for our front yard sign. I held several classes, no charge of course, for friends. I really enjoyed those classes, telling stories and lies to each other. We had a great time. Here's a life-size swan that I did. It has very little feather detail because it was originally carved as an outside ornamental piece. Here's a pair of chickadees. I made several sets of these chickadees and gave most of them away to friends and family over the years. Here's one of the several wood ducks that I carved. I entered one of them in the Ocean City Ward Foundation Carving Show in Ocean City, Maryland, and got lucky. Here's a great horned owl that I entered in the show. The owl is landing on a stump, hunting a couple of mice in the hollow. Apparently, it didn't impress the judges. No ribbon. Here's a miniature mallard decoy that I converted into a business card holder. I kept it on my desk all during the 20 years that I owned Sting Security Incorporated. Here's a half-size blue heron that I entered in the Ocean City Ward Foundation show. It turned out it was more complicated than most carvings that I had done to that point. For example, because the legs were so long and thin, in order to support the body, I had to use brass rods. I welded them together and covered the brass with Bondo to carve out the leg scales in detail. Another challenge I had was the long dangling feathers in the front breast. There were a lot of them. It took a long time carving in the minute details. Because it wasn't life-size, I entered it as a miniature, but it was disqualified because miniature carvings could only be no longer than 12 inches, and the heron was over 2 feet tall. I later entered it in a show in Connecticut with less stringent rules and was lucky enough to win a ribbon. One day I got a call from Ducks Unlimited. They wanted me to make them 25 smooth miniature duck decoys that they were going to use as awards for their upcoming event. As you can imagine, it took a long time. First, I had to carve each one so that it duplicated all the others. Then I had to stain them all. When I was done, I divided the hours it took me to do the job into what they paid me. Bottom line, I worked for about 50 cents an hour. But that was okay because it was for a good cause. I took 3 training courses at the Vermont Raptor Academy. These were 1-week sessions taught by the world-renowned champion blue ribbon carver Floyd Schultz. I carved this miniature red-tailed hawk. The next time I carved this miniature golden eagle. And the last carving was this saw-whet owl. The owl was among the most difficult carvings I've ever done. That's because, as you can see, the owl's head is turned completely around facing backwards. As a result, the anatomy was constantly throwing me off, but somehow I managed it. But please don't give it too close a look. After one of the classes, the local newspaper did a small write-up. Here's one of my green-winged teal carvings. Incidentally, when I went to carving shows around the country, I noticed that there were always a lot of vendors selling tools and supplies to carvers. Since most carvers worked indoors and dust was a major problem, I came up with this idea. Make a laptop dust collector with storage for carving tools, thus the carver's caddy. The carver caddy is a large dresser-type box with wheels. It has a roll-up desktop with electric power. It has several shelves for storage and 3 storage drawers. But what makes it unique was the laptop vacuum that removes dust as you carve and sand wood. I thought it was such a great idea that I got a friend of mine, Jimmy Hare, and we made a few units and then rented a booth at the Ward Foundation carving show in Ocean City. Well, we sold none. So much for that idea, but I'm still using mine today. One day I was approached by a large law firm that asked me to carve a life-size bald eagle for their lobby. I always wanted to carve a life-size eagle, so I gave it a shot. Because of its size, carving it in one piece would be almost impossible, especially since Tupelo didn't come in blocks that big. So I used several blocks of Tupelo. After several trial and error sessions, I finally was satisfied with the base outline of the bird. Once the wings were attached, it was time for detailing the feathers. As you know, the wing has several hundred feathers, each of them comprising of quills and barbs. Carving out each one was very, very time consuming. And then there were the tail feathers, which was another challenge. But the biggest challenge was the head. As you know, when you look at someone, or any living creature for that matter, you first focus on their eyes and face. Everything else is secondary. That's why I felt it was so important. I made several heads until I was satisfied. Again, time consuming. The legs and talons were another challenge. Wooden legs and feet would obviously be too fragile because of the weight of the body. So to support the body, I used brass rods just like I did with the blue heron. After I welded them together, I inserted them into the upper leg and then covered them with Bondo so I could carve the scales and talon details. Rather than have it just stand there, I carved a rockfish that would be held in its talons. As a reference, I used a frozen rockfish. That rockfish was in and out of the freezer so many times that my wife Estelle told me she was going to start charging me freezer rent. Because the talons were wrapped around the fish, the eagle couldn't stand on its own 2 feet. It needed something to support it. So I made this large rock. It is a wooden form that's covered with hardware screen. The screen was then covered with Bondo, thus allowing me to text the rock later. I can't tell you how many good pieces of carving that I ruined because of my lack of experience in painting. I learned early on that carving and painting were 2 separate arts. When you paint a carving with a brush, it's very tedious at best, especially when you're trying to blend colors. I soon learned that using an airbrush was much more forgiving. that didn't mean I still didn't use a brush occasionally. Believe it or not, painting this eagle took almost as long as carving it. Between carving and painting, working on it 10 to 15 hours a week, it took me about 3 years to complete. That's probably because I was too bent on detail and authenticity. When it was finished, it had a 6-foot wingspan and stood 5.5 feet high, including the rock. Incidentally, about halfway into the carving, I found out that the law firm had split up, so now I had no buyer. But I didn't let that stop me. I was not going to quit. As coincidence would have it, now that the eagle was finished, I found out that the annual Ward Foundation and Carving Show was coming up in Ocean City, so I thought I'd take a shot and enter it. I knew that the competition was probably over my head for this type of an entry. After all, the competing artists were coming in from all over the world. But I thought, what do I have to lose? Maybe I'll get lucky. There was one problem. How was I going to get this eagle to Ocean City in one piece? The eagle display was made in 2 units. One was the eagle holding the fish, and the other was the supporting rock. I made 2 boxes to protect it during transport, one for the eagle and the other for the rock. On a side note, I had just finished a carving class with some friends. It was a sawwood owl carving class using the sawwood owl I showed you earlier. Don Hooker and Bruce Kimball, 2 of my friends and neighbors, were in the class. When I told them I was entering the eagle in the Ward show in Ocean City, they volunteered to help me set up. They also said they wanted to enter their carvings in the show. We got there on a Friday with our wives and entered our exhibits. That afternoon, I got a call that my brother-in-law had passed away in New Jersey. Estelle and I would have to leave, but we would be back on Sunday before the show ended. When we got back on Sunday, I met up with Don and Bruce and asked them how I did. They told me that I didn't win. Well, I wasn't really expecting to win anyway. The competition was just too heavy. They came from all over the world, and who was I? But they told me that they won. When I heard that, I was a bit taken back since this was their first show. Their carvings were good, but not ribbon quality. But who was I to judge? After a few minutes, they told me the truth. They had taken the ribbons off of someone else's carvings, put them next to theirs, then took a picture, and then put the ribbons back. They really got me on that one. Since I no longer had a buyer, and obviously it was too big for the house, I mean, where would I put an eagle 5.5 feet high and 6 feet wingspan? I really didn't want to go through the hassle of trying to sell it, but it did need a home. So I contacted my American Legion Post number 206 in Chesapeake Beach, Maryland, and donated it to them. And that's where it sits today, in the main hall lobby. I put together a bunch of Tupelo blocks and made this miniature carousel horse. All my grandchildren rode it occasionally in their early years, and now my great-grandchildren are taking turns riding it. Speaking of horses, I made these rocking horses. I made this rocking horse for my grandson David, and this rocking horse for my granddaughter Sarah, and then this one for my granddaughter Ashley. And then when they got children, guess who got to ride them? I also made this cradle that some of the grandchildren used. For fun, I made these caricatures: a self-portrait of me carving, a cowboy, West Virginia hillbilly characters, a moonshiner, a deliverance banjo player, and a mama hillbilly. And this cop holding a thief reminded me of my police career days. Speaking of my police career, I carved this 2-foot replica of the Metropolitan Police Badge. I also made this Christmas wreath that had a police badge wrapped with a black ribbon in memory of all the police officers who were killed in the line of duty. My woodworking is not limited to just carving. As I said in the beginning, I built the Quack Shack. I also built our gazebo with some ducks adding to the ambience. In 1983, my 3 sons and I built our barn with a little help from our first grandson. When we finished it, we celebrated by having a barn dance with families and friends. Another project was these duplicate doll houses for my granddaughters Sarah and Ashley. Believe it or not, they still have them. When we moved into the Fairyland and Woods community over 40 years ago, there was a painted sign at the entrance. After several years, it started to wear away. I replaced it with a 3D carved replica. In fact, I've replaced it several times since. When my wife Estelle passed away in June of 2021, the community placed a black drape over the sign. That was a very touching and appreciated tribute. People have asked me why I chose carving rather than painting. I think painting is a wonderful expression of reality and takes a special talent, which I tried, but wasn't very successful. I know many people that can do both, and they're very good at it. I'm just not one of them. But my real answer is, I feel that unlike painting, which represents an illusion of three-dimensional space on a flat surface, carving actually inhabits the space shared by the viewer. Plus you can touch it and feel the textures and forms. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching.